All right, I hope everyone had a good break. I want to start today by going over the corrections on the quiz that you took, quiz 3. This was a quiz that most of you did extremely well on. It also concentrated on some things that you really need to know that are kind of important. Like, for example, the matching at the top asks you, first of all, to identify a trapezoid. Number 1 was a trapezoid. Okay, and again, a trapezoid, strange sounding word, is a quadrilateral, a four-sided polygon that has one pair of parallel lines. The one in here that was a trapezoid was number C. And again, it looked like this. All right, and again, the top and the bottom were the parallel lines. By the way, those parallel lines are what are called the bases. So this would be like base 1 and base 2. And then the sides are called the legs. And again, it's like a table that has legs that holds it up. But anyway, trapezoid C was number 1. Number 2, a rhombus. Now, a rhombus is a quadrilateral, okay, with all sides congruent. And how do you tell that the sides are congruent? Okay, you tell the sides are congruent because they have little lines through them, little line segments through them. And there were 2 rhombuses on here. The first one was A, and it looked like a diamond. And how did I know it was a rhombus? Because it had the little line segments through the sides saying they were congruent. And the other one was D. And again, when you look at D, some people go, but Mr. Duke, that's not a rhombus. That's a square. You're right, it is a square, because every square is a rhombus, because every square has all sides congruent. So squares are rhombi. Okay, by the way, that's the plural for rhombus is rhombi. No, what the heck? I don't know what happened to the lighting, but we lost the lighting for a second, but it's back now. Now, number 3 was a rectangle. And again, a rectangle is a quadrilateral with all angles congruent. And again, there were 2 rectangles on here. The first one was B, and it looked like this. And how did I know that all the angles were congruent? Because they were all 90 degrees. And how did I know they were all 90 degrees? Because they were L-shaped and they had little boxes on them. And that made it a rectangle. But the other rectangle was D. They go, but Mr. D was a square. That's right, because just like every square is a rhombus, every square is also a rectangle. Because not only does it have all sides congruent, it also has all 90-degree angles. All right, and you say, well, what is a square? It's a rhombus and a rectangle. Exactly, it's a rhombus and a rectangle put together. So number 4, there was only one square, and the square was D. And again, you go, but wouldn't D be a square? Aren't rectangles squares? No, rectangles don't have to be squares, but squares have to be rectangles. And you go, I don't get that. Why is that? The reason why is because a rectangle doesn't need to have all sides congruent, but a square does. So a rectangle doesn't have to be a square, but a square does need to have all angles congruent, and that's what a rectangle is. And a rhombus doesn't have to have all angles congruent. It just has to have all sides congruent. And a square has all sides congruent. But a square doesn't need to have all but a square does need to have all angles congruent, but a rhombus doesn't. So anyway, that was the matching. 1 was C, 2 was A and D, 3 was B and D, and 4 was D. Now, the next one, 5 and 6, had 2 answers for each because you had to tell each triangle, classify it in 2 ways. So number 5, the triangle looked like this, okay? And again, it was an acute triangle, because all the angles are less than 90 degrees. Less than 90, less than 90, less than 90. And it was isosceles because only two sides were congruent. Gotta spell isosceles. There you go. That's the E there. By the way, a lot of you call it acute equilateral because most of the time the acute ones are equilateral, but the truth is acute triangles don't have to be equilateral, but equilateral triangles have to be acute. But anyway, this was an acute isosceles. And number 6 looked like this. And this one was an obtuse because it had one angle greater than 90, and it was also scaling because it had no sides congruent. And how did I know it had no sides congruent? Because there were no lines to any of the sides. So again, whenever you name a triangle, you can name it by angles, acute or obtuse, and we could name it by sides, isosceles and scaling. All right, I did not have a right triangle on here, and again, to be a right triangle, you have to have the L shape. But that was the answers to 5 and 6. Now, the last ones, number 7 and 8, asked you to find a missing angle. And you knew 2 angles, and they asked you to find 1. By the way, in problem number 7, it was a right triangle because it had an L-shaped 90 degree. I don't know if you can read that. That's 90 degrees. And it had a 30-degree angle down here. And it asks you to find the angle up here. Now again, whenever you know 2 angles of a triangle, you can find the third one because altogether the 3 angles have to add up to 180 degrees. So first, find out how much you have altogether. 90 plus 30 add up to be 120 degrees. And then take that away from the total of 180. And if you take 120 away from 180, you get 60 degrees. So x equals 60 degrees. The measure of the missing angle was 60 degrees. And again, all 3 angles together add up to 180. So if you know 2 of them, add the 2 you know, subtract from 180 gives you the one you don't know. And the last one was an obtuse scaling, and I knew the obtuse angle was 123 degrees, okay, and another angle was 18 degrees. So once again, to find the missing angle, x, add the 2 you know, 123 plus 18 adds up to be 11, carry your 1, 4, 141, and then take the total, 180 minus 141. Borrow from the 8 and make it a 7. 10 minus 1 is 9. 7 minus 4 is 3. And your answer was 39 degrees. So this was the answer to number 7, 60 degrees. And this was the answer to number 8, 39 degrees. And again, when you know 2 angles of a triangle, you find the third angle by adding the 2 angles you know and then subtracting from 180. By the way, I realized when I went to give you this quiz that there was something I was supposed to teach you about parallelograms that I did not teach you, okay? Because it was supposed to be on this quiz and I had to take it off. And it is kind of, part of it is kind of important to what we're going on to next. So I want to throw that in right now and give you a homework on that. The thing that you need to know about a parallelogram is opposite sides of a parallelogram are congruent. And again, what does that mean? Opposite sides of a parallelogram are congruent? Well, it basically means they have the same measurement. And if you looked at a parallelogram, you could kind of see that this distance and this distance are the same, and this distance and that distance are the same. but it's important to note that it doesn't just look the same, but it is the same. So in other words, if I knew that this was, say, 8 centimeters, then that would have to be 8 centimeters. And if this was 3 centimeters, that would have to be 3 centimeters, because opposite sides are congruent. By the way, it's also true that opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent. And again, first of all, opposite angles are angles that are across from each other. So if this was angle, say, angle A, and this was angle C, they would be opposite each other, and they would have the same measurement. So say this was 120 degrees, then this would have to be 120 degrees, because they're opposite angles and they're congruent. By the way, we also have something that says consecutive angles of a parallelogram are supplementary. And remember what supplementary means. Supplementary means they add up to 180 degrees. By the way, you say, okay, I get supplementary, but what does consecutive mean? Well, consecutive means one after the other. So if I wanted to know what's consecutive to A, it's what comes after it as you go around. So consecutive to A would be B, or consecutive to A would be D, because those are the two that come after A. Going to the right comes after A is B, going down after A is D. You say, well, they're all consecutive. No, C is not consecutive. C is opposite. But B and D are consecutive. So if I knew this was 120, how could I find this one? I'll give you a hint, they're supplementary. And if they're supplementary, what that means is you take 180 minus 120 would tell you that this is 60. And this is 60. By the way, these have to both be 60 because they're opposite angles, and opposite angles are congruent. And they both have to be 60 because they're both consecutive angles to A, and that means they're supplementary. By the way, they're consecutive to C too, and they're supplementary. So the truth is, if you know one angle of a parallelogram, you actually know all four. The opposite angle is congruent, and the consecutive angles are supplementary. And you can find the supplementary ones from subtracting from 180. I'll give you some notes on this and a homework on this, okay? But I wanted to go over that with you. So you have two things on this video: how to correct the quiz 3, and also how to find the missing sides of a parallelogram and the missing angles of a parallelogram.